Verse 4, before they lay down, so they've barely cleared the table now, ready to lie down for the night, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. We're talking about a scary situation. And again, if we're using Sodom and Gomorrah as our metaphor for the wicked world, have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt compassed round? Just like wondering, is there no safe space left? Is there no, here's my little ring of righteousness, but outside I'm feeling hemmed in from every angle. And can I maintain safety here? You parents that are worried about your children, do you sometimes feel compassed round by evil influences? Does it affect both the old and the young? Does it seem to come from every quarter? Nowhere to run to, nowhere to hide. Well, am I still safe within my sanctuary of standards? I hope so. Now, verse 5, it goes from scary to nightmarish. They called unto Lot, and they said unto him, where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. And by now we should know that word know. It's that yada Hebrew word. It's that intimate knowledge that in the right way describes that experiential connection with God. This is life eternal, that they might know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom thou hast sent. On the worst case scenario, well, somewhere in the middle is the kind of intimate knowledge between an Abraham and Sarah. There's that pleasure that she was referring to. There is, and again, in her case, it is the joy, the true meaningful joy of family relationships. That's the pleasure post-paradise. That's the Eden east of Eden, in our relationships, in our families. This situation is a far cry from that. Here are these wicked men of Sodom seeking the righteous men within. Bring them out so we can know them. This is intimate knowledge. This is sexual assault that is being threatened. Now, this is what I was referring to at the beginning of today's lesson when I mentioned that there are things that we'd probably prefer to dance around that instead we need to really wrestle with. And this is one of them. Sodom has become synonymous with homosexuality. And that's a really tricky subject in today's environment. And especially for those of us, myself included, who have family members and friends and beloved students within the LGBTQ community. And I want to be as sensitive as I possibly can to their feelings and the righteous desires of their hearts. And so I pray for the Holy Ghost to help us navigate this next conversation, okay, before we get back to the specifics of what's about to happen in Sodom and Gomorrah. Now first, let me talk about Sodom itself as a symbol. And in this case, Sodom becomes a sister city, or even a sister civilization, to other places that become synonymous with wickedness also. There's a whole array of symbols for our wicked world. This one is Sodom. The more famous one is Babylon, right? So often you'll see, especially in the Doctrine and Covenants, it's flee Babylon. In the book of Revelation, it's all about getting out of Babylon. Babylon becomes the ultimate symbol for the wicked world, okay? But there's others. Section 1 of the Doctrine and Covenants talks about Idumea, or the world. So he's being clear here. When I talk about Idumea, I mean the world, okay? And Idumea is just Edom. That's Esau instead of Jacob. We'll see that next week, okay? Now, another one would be Egypt. Egypt, a place of bondage, of servitude, and it will take God's almighty wonders to free us, to bring us back to our promised land. Oh, that all sounds very symbolic. We'll see that when we get to Exodus. So whether it's Babylon or Idumea or Egypt or Sodom, we're talking about the wicked world. Now, Sodom is an amazing metaphor for this partly because of its geographic location. It's like the lowest civilization on earth because the Jordan River Valley is below sea level. Now think about that. This is civilization at its absolute lowest. Has it gotten to a point where we're hitting rock bottom as far as our standards or lack thereof is concerned. Now, it's on the shores of the Dead Sea. It's about as close to death, spiritual death, as you can get. That tells me something. What makes the Dead Sea dead, by the way? Well, you have all this fresh water flowing in. There's the Jordan River. We see all that it's receiving. And no wonder it's a well-watered plain, right? No wonder Lot was tempted to go that direction. No wonder he described it as the garden of the Lord. I mean, this is Eden 2.0. Well, it's a counterfeit Eden, though. It receives all these blessings. It just never passes them on. Because the Dead Sea is dead because the fresh water just evaporates, leaving all this sediment. I mean, you thought the Great Salt Lake was salty. That's nothing compared to the Dead Sea. When I went there, I mean, we swam in it. Or better yet, we swam on it. Because your body doesn't even sink. I felt like a hovercraft swimming on top of the water. It was the weirdest feeling. But man, you get a splash of that water in your eye and it's like, instant blindness, which we'll see later in this chapter, the blindness of Sodom. I mean, to that kind of salt content, it is intense. And we'll see a pillar of salt emerge later on in this chapter also. There's so many amazing things about this story. So take all of its symbolism and why it fits so well as a metaphor for wickedness, but also take its result, its consequences, its destruction, and it becomes a symbol ever after for the consequences of sin. Okay? So, for example, in the book of Deuteronomy, we're not too far ahead yet, but already it's being looked back on as, careful, you don't want to end up like Sodom. It says in Deuteronomy 32, "For their vine is of the vine of Sodom, and of the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of gall. Their clusters are bitter." I mean, we sing about, "He hath trampled out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored." Well, the grapes of wrath, or here the grapes of gall, that's the vintage of Sodom and Gomorrah. So be careful about drinking whatever it is that they're putting in your cup. In Isaiah, he says, "Hear the word of the Lord, ye rulers of Sodom. Give ear unto the law of our God, ye people of Gomorrah." Now, Sodom and Gomorrah are long since gone by Isaiah's day. But you see what he's doing? I'm talking to you rulers of Israel and Judah, but I might as well be talking to the rulers of Sodom and Gomorrah, because you're living like they did, which should tell you about what's about to come. How about this one from Jeremiah? "I have seen also in the prophets of Jerusalem an horrible thing. They commit adultery, they walk in lies, they strengthen also the hands of evildoers, that none doth return from his wickedness. They are all of them unto me as Sodom, and the inhabitants thereof as Gomorrah." See what Jeremiah is doing? Not only is he warning his people about, you're just like Sodom and Gomorrah, and you're going to end up like Sodom and Gomorrah. And they did, to Babylon in their day. Okay, all these sister civilizations coming together as one. But in describing his day, he just tipped us off to what's going on in Sodom also. Notice his list. Adultery, so there we see sexual sin. Walking in lies, there's dishonesty. Strengthening the hands of evildoers. That's an interesting one. Talk about lack of justice and judgment. Instead of calling you to repentance, no, I'll applaud you in what you're doing. I mean, who am I to speak up or speak out against you? You think that's right? Then that's totally fine. I'm all for you. You do you, and no judgment from me. No wonder, he says, none doth return from his wickedness. Nobody thinks what they're doing is wicked. This is such moral relativism. We'll see more of that later on in this story. So again, no wonder there's no one repenting, because there's no one calling them to repentance. Now, there's another example. We'll see this one in the book of Jude. So New Testament, they're still referring back to Sodom and Gomorrah. He says, "Even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh." And again, that's what's become synonymous with Sodom. Fornication, so again, sexual sin, but specifically he calls it strange flesh, something bodily, something carnal that's out of the ordinary. It's strange. There's something unnatural about this type of of carnal appetite. Now, here again, I want to be incredibly sensitive and as specific as I can be. So please bear with me as I struggle for the right language here. To put it in perspective first, though, one last example of someone looking back to Sodom to help his people understand what they're doing, but also to help us understand what these people were doing. This is the most important one of all, okay? This is Ezekiel 16, 49 and 50. He says, "Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom." So yes, these are sister cities and sister symbols. And he begins to list what was wrong with Sodom that's also wrong with his people that are now in Babylon, okay? Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. Then in 50, and they were haughty, there's pridefulness, and committed abomination before me. Therefore I took them away as I saw good. Now 50 is more where we see the sexual sin, where we see the immorality, this abomination. But do not lose sight of verse 49, where we see pride and, notice, fullness of bread, not strengthening the hands of the poor and the needy. You understand what's going on here? Again, if this is the garden of God, if this is the well-watered field, if this is a place where you can get rich quick, again, no wonder that conglomeration of Mesopotamian kings is exacting tribute from them, right? No wonder the king of Sodom is willing to give all kinds of threads and shoe latchets and all kinds of things beyond it to Father Abraham. It's, oh, we can always make more money. It's a piece of cake. But they're hogging it all to themselves. They're letting the Jordan flow in and they're not letting anything flow out. And so there's no Middle Eastern hospitality here. And not because they can't afford to give, it's fullness of bread. Then why not share it with poor and needy? Well, because of my pride. I earned it. They probably earned what they don't have. And abundance of idleness, that would just take more work. You barely had to work for what you got. What are you complaining about? Remember 2 years ago in the Book of Mormon, we saw how often idleness and idolatry go together? We talked about idleness, I-D-L-E, leading to idleness, I-D-O-L, which stands to reason since those gods don't ask anything of me. They can't give me anything, but they don't take anything either. That's a good deal. As opposed to this God of Israel, I got to go pay tithes to the king of Salem? Nah. The true God that makes demands upon our discipleship. Real worship includes real work. As opposed to an idol that allows me to remain idle all the days of my life. Now, what I want to do here is, well, for lack of a better phrase, convict us all. Because I worry sometimes that from one angle, it's easy to use Sodom and Gomorrah and as a symbol, or maybe even worse, as a club to beat someone else into shame or submission, instead of realizing that just like all water flows downhill and tries to find its way to the lowest possible point, namely Sodom, in our worst moments, we all descend in that direction. And for some of us, it might not be sexual sin. It might not be something so specific as homosexual behavior. And we'll talk about that more clearly in a moment. But what about the other side of it? You might not feel a twinge of guilt when you read Ezekiel 16:50, but maybe we ought to when we read Ezekiel 16:49. When we see the immorality of Sodom, maybe we pat ourselves on the back and think, oh, I'm not guilty of that. But when we see the inhumanity of Sodom, maybe we're being called to repent. In fact, let me put these two things side by side in one of my favorite visual aids, a chart. On the one hand, we have the sexual sin side of Sodom. On the other hand, we have the neglect of the poor and needy side of Sodom. So we see immorality versus inhumanity. I told you from the last chapter, I need to see the cry and the sin for myself. So I'm going to go down to Sodom. Is it as bad as they say? Sin is on that first column. Cry is on that second. And yeah, we might not be guilty of those specific sins of Sodom, but are we causing other people to utter similar cries out of our neglect? In the first column, we see sins of commission, where the second column, it's sins of omission. Specifically, in the first column, it's sins against law, but in the second, it's sins against love. Yes, the first column needs to work on the law of chastity, but the second column needs to work on the law of charity. In fact, it's interesting that within our political climate, from the right side of the aisle, there's such concern, outrage, moral outrage over the first column, the immorality of Sodom. But on the left, there is justifiable moral outrage for those that are guilty of the inhumanity of Sodom. What I'm trying to do here is prove a set of contraries, if you haven't guessed yet. And it's interesting that even in the context of LGBT issues, Elder Oakes gave a talk once called Law and Love. Can you hear the contraries being proven? He gave another talk called Truth and Tolerance. Can you hear the contraries being proven? And especially on LGBT issues. One side is constantly teaching law, but are they equally emphasizing love on their part? That same group is always hitting hard on truth. This is how you're supposed to be living. But are they flexing their own muscles to be equally tolerant? I'll just put it this way. I hope we all feel a twinge of guilt, or maybe better said, a call to come up out of the valley of the Dead Sea and be better. Be better within ourselves or be better towards other people. To lift our standards and lift our sights. And to put it bluntly, if you are chastising others as they are striving to live the law of chastity, you better be trying just as hard to live the law of charity. It is unfair on one group's side to just assume that our side should be easy when we realize just how hard the other side might be. And if we are willing to ask a difficult sacrifice to live the law of chastity, when in many cases it would mean celibacy, and none of the Eden east of Eden that Sarah was referring to, not in this life, then are we flexing our muscles just as hard to be kind and to be compassionate, to be understanding and forgiving? Are we living the law of charity at equal cost, is what I'm asking. I hope that we are. I'll also say, by the way, that by the time Ezekiel 16 ends, that all-important chapter that shows both sides of Sodom, it does hold out hope for repentance, and that would involve both sides as well. In Ezekiel 16:60, he says, "Nevertheless, I will remember my covenant with thee in the days of thy youth, and I will establish unto thee an everlasting covenant." That covenant was meant for the Israelites of his day facing Babylon. It's true of us in our day facing the wicked world. It was true of the people in Abraham and Lot's day as they were facing the wickedness of Sodom. And for the people of Sodom, you can change. You can be forgiven. You can become more chaste and more charitable. You can become more Christ-like. God will remember his covenant, I assure you. Now, that's a more general view, but be specific in terms of what Lot says and what the men of Sodom say in response. And again, the JST helps us with this. There are some fascinating insights here. Let's look at a few of them. In verse 9, for example, they say, "Stand back." This is the King James Version still. "And they said again, this one fellow came in to sojourn, and he will needs be a judge." It's like, forget that. Now will we deal worse with thee than with them. And they pressed sore upon the man, even Lot, and came near to break the door. Okay, he closed it behind him. That's not even going to be enough. And if you go in to hide, believe me, we will break the door down to come after you. Whoa. Again, you see this, we're at a battle line here. The door of his home. What influences must I keep out? What will I let in? And they're getting to a point of, we're going to come in no matter how hard you try to keep us out. And sadly, we live in a day that even our doors can't protect us, because people will come in through the internet lines. And sadly, we don't even need cables for those anymore. Not sadly. I'm grateful for Wi-Fi, okay? But boy, is it scary, because I don't have a door I can shut. The dividing lines have been so blurred in our day. We have to be incredibly vigilant. Well, they're trying to break the door down. What am I going to do here? But also notice what they said. This one fellow, there's only one of them. We can stand up to that. Have you ever felt like it's such a tiny minority, we can't stand up or make a difference? We can't say a thing. I'm only one. They also said, he came in to sojourn. In other words, he's not even one of us. He's this nomad, kind of come and go. It's just a matter of time, and I'm sure he'll leave. And do we sometimes struggle with that too? Do we feel opposition saying, you're in the minority, when actually we're in the majority? It's just, sadly, it's a silent majority that is being cowed into submission by a very vocal minority on some of these social issues. Well, it's just one. It's just a sojourner. In other words, this isn't permanent. Your position here isn't permanent, or perhaps this standard isn't permanent. Well, things change. And on these particular issues, at least in the modern West, I don't know if we've seen a change so fast. To make traditional marriage into a sojourner and one that's no longer welcome in society, it's amazing how fast that has happened. And then that third part, and you're going to be a judge of us when your time has passed, even though that time lasted for thousands of years? No, you can't judge us. This was the problem with Laman and Lemuel, remember? That they accused Lehi of being judgmental against the people of Jerusalem. They accused little brother Nephi of wanting to judge them. How dare you think you can teach us or judge us or lead us in any way? It's so interesting how often you are accused of being judgmental, even when you simply are holding to a different standard. Oh, no, it's prideful, it's judgmental, I used to struggle with that sometimes when people would say, yeah, I'm out of the church because Latter-day Saints are so judgmental. I remember with one friend, we were close enough I could be honest here and go, wait. Isn't that judging all Latter-day Saints? I mean, have you felt me judging you? It's like, well, no, but everyone else does. I'm like, isn't that kind of a judgmental statement about being judgmental? Careful. But here that's what they're saying. Again, that phrase so well describes what we're up against. Believe me, you're not only one. The standards you are holding to are not sojourners in the land. They're not a passing fancy. It's not that we're passing, well, it is we're passing judgment, but I pray that it's righteous judgment. Again, speaking of JST, when the King James says, judge not, that ye be not judged, some take that so far to say, see, we shouldn't judge others. Just live and let live, and you do you, and that's fine. And that's the day we live in. But that's moral relativism. The JST of judge not that ye be not judged is much more clear and careful. Judge not unrighteously, but judge righteous judgment. We are always making decisions, and that's judgment calls. Okay? And then the idea of breaking down the door, yes, it's intimidating to stand up for what's right. Again, that's why I think that professor was like, you seem a little too happy, a little too clueless. Do you have any idea what you're up against? I'm like, yeah, I do. But what you going to do? You got to go teach truth, and do it as sensitively as possible. Elder Maxwell once said, as only Elder Maxwell could, that the gradual normalization of aberration is the most subtle form of intimidation. Now, that's a lot of Asians. Did you catch it, though? Do you feel intimidated by the fact that aberration has now become normalized, the gradual normalization of aberration. And say, no, now that those exceptions that we could treat exceptionally and help and lift and serve and welcome, no, has now been welcomed to the point we didn't just correct, we've overcorrected. It used to be all law and no love, but instead of coming and trying to balance it in the Goldilocks zone, it's now become all love and no law, to the point that law is completely unwelcome, and in fact, it's become unlawful. It used to be all truth and no tolerance, but instead of coming to balance them, it's now all tolerance and no truth. And so it's all just relative. And now are we made to feel judgmental when that's not what we're trying to be? Are we made to seem unloving when it's a higher form of love to try to lift people to greater happiness and peace and rest for them within the sanctuary of standards, within the confines of covenant? Well, a couple other things here. In the JST of Genesis 19:11, there's this interesting phrase. The men of Sodom, as they're ready to pound the door down, it says, send them out. Send out the men and send out your daughters. We'll take everybody. And it says, and we will do with them as seemeth us good. Now, this was after the wickedness of Sodom. Did you catch the phrases? We're going to do what seems good to us. That's definition of moral relativism. That's the definition of you do you. And if it seems good to you, then it's probably good. This is what the sociologists call the social construction of reality, or even the social construction of morality. It's only what we collectively decide it is, which is a denial of God, a denial of ultimate truth, a denial of independent morality, and instead it's simply social construction and situational ethics. I mean, as they said, this is after the wickedness of Sodom. This is just how it is here, okay? This is our norm. So quit fighting against it. Another phrase here, again from the JST. Lot says to them, God will not justify his servant in this thing. Wherefore let me plead with my brethren, this once only, that unto these men ye do nothing, that they may have peace in my house. Now, two phrases there to wrestle with. When Lot says, God will not justify his servant in this thing, he's not talking about them. He's not saying, he won't justify you in that. He's talking about himself. I'm God's servant, and he won't justify me in this thing. What thing? In not letting you know that this is wrong. In not standing up for truth. If I simply wash my hands of any kind of responsibility here and do nothing to rock the boat, God will not justify his servant in this thing. Do you understand how much courage it takes on the part of prophets and apostles to stand up to popular opinion and teach truth unapologetically? That takes guts. But God cannot justify his servants for not doing that. It's amazing what they're willing to do. What Jesus said about John the Baptist, and John the Baptist spoke truth to power. He called out Herod for sins of immorality, and he paid for it with his life. But what does Jesus say about John the Baptist? He says, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken with the wind? Is that what you were expecting? Think about that, a reed shaken with the wind. When the wind blows among the cattails, those reeds all bend in the direction that the wind is blowing. I've never seen an obstinate reed stand up to the wind and say, no, I will not cow to your directions. I see politicians doing it all the time. I've sometimes joked that there are a lot of wet fingers in Washington, D.C., but none in Salt Lake City. Wet finger in terms of licking it to hold it up to see which way the winds of popular opinion happen to be blowing today. Well, I've got to support my constituents, right? I've got to vote whatever they want. There's the subtle intimidation, especially from a vocal minority. Whereas John the Baptist, no wet finger there. I know what's right, and I have to stand up for it. And the same can be said of our prophets and apostles today. They're not reeds bending in the wind. They're standing up for truth, and God justifies them in that, even if popular opinion won't. In fact, the opposite is true. God couldn't justify them if they did otherwise. By the way, we're his servants too. It can't just be, we get so careful. We have to walk a tightrope on this. But we do need to honor agency on the one hand, but stand for truth and righteousness on the other. Okay? The other phrase is, well, let me plead with my brethren this once only, to don't do anything wrong here. And that's a concern of mine. I really respect Lot for that first line. He won't justify me in doing nothing. But that second part, well, just once, I've got to stand up to you. Yeah, we might have to keep standing up. And on this one, when it's a matter of, I'm going to try to get in your way this one time. In this one instance, I've got to let you know how wrong it is. Because if we only stand up to specific instances, then it might seem like we're talking about preferences instead of principles. It might seem like we're just trying to make exceptions, but we accept your general rule. And we can't do that either. Now, this is extremely hard to do in a pluralistic society, especially at this time period where, well, Elder Packer used to say this. At least the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah seemed to be localized in those places. They are now generalized, and there's nowhere to go to escape Sodom and Gomorrah anymore. Okay? Again, it's not just the door that we can close. It's not that simple anymore. Elder Packer and others have said it's no longer the great and spacious building over there across the river. And here we are safe behind our iron rod. No, now, thanks to technology, we're all growing up within the great and spacious building. We're raising our children within the great and spacious building. What are we going to do to establish some kind of sanctuary even here? Well, we get a hint of that in verse 10 and 11. In verse 10, the men, and the JST here, the angels of God, which were holy men, they put forth their hand and pulled Lot into the house to them and shut to the door. Remember that earlier Lot was pressing upon them greatly to bring them in? Well, now it's their turn. Not just pressing upon him greatly, but literally reaching out and grabbing him and bringing him in. This time this is justified, okay? He wasn't forcing them in, but they really are saving him. That's interesting too, that sometimes the people we save end up saving us. And the standards we were inviting people into will save us all. So come back in, Lot. Let us help you. And then they shut the door. There's always this sense of keeping the door closed and not just opening yourself to these outside influences. Well, then verse 11, and this is that blindness I mentioned when it comes to getting some salt in your eye. Verse 11, they smote the men that were at the door of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves to find the door. That's one of my favorite phrases in this whole chapter. Can you imagine some way to just pray, God, please smite them with blindness. Help them not see how to reach us. If anything, open their eyes to see the consequences of their decisions, but close their eyes when it comes to them looking for a way to enter my home. Don't let them find a way in. In fact, let's make it so hard for them that they just get tired and give up. Because that's what happened with these men of Sodom. They wearied themselves in finding the door. Can you picture all these newly blinded people that are just reaching and searching, trying to find a way in? That visual image is haunting, but it describes so well what the world all around us. But if we can hold tight, if we can stick to our standards, will it get to a point where they just give up? Because they're tired of our obstinance. They realize they're not giving in. Remember, Satan is good at persistence, but not so good at endurance. Resist the devil and he will flee from thee, the scriptures say. Just let them get tired before we do. That's the problem. I think we tire before they do. But the old saying, all it takes for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. So we have to do something, and we have to persist in doing it. until they get tired instead of us.